Okay, for our sketch, we're going to be doing a cone shadow diagram. So it's going to be kind of like the egg shadows we looked at earlier in this class. And the reason we're doing cones to practice is because the folds of fabric, or the drapery drawing that we're going to do in this module, they often are in a conical or a cone shape. So practicing these kind of geometric, simple shapes and practicing shading them will help you when you go into more observation of something more complex, but you'll have the basic shape and how the shading works with those basic shapes. And that will help you then transfer this knowledge that we're going to gain through this sketch into your project and more finished drawings. So we're going to start here with the base of the cone. And there's a photo that I'll link to, and you can find a lot of photos if you Google like still life, geometric shapes, or educational drawing. That's how I found it. So I'm going to start with a straight line, and just to make it easy to divide, I'm going to make it 4 inches here. You do not have to measure yours, but I'm going to start with a line for the base. I'm starting with pencil. I'm using a B pencil just so it shows up better on the video, but you could start with a lighter pencil like an 2H. And then I'm going to make a mark where the center of this line is at 2 inches. So again, you don't have to measure, but I'm just doing that to kind of show you what's happening. And so the base of the cone shape is a circle, but since we're looking at it from the side, it is an ellipse, because an ellipse is a circle in perspective. So I like to make the center line about the width of where my ellipse will be. And you can kind of almost make like a triangle from the corners to the center line. Remember, straight lines are easier to draw than curved lines. So if you're having trouble getting this right, you can draw a straight line first, and then you can kind of curve it to get the curve right. So take your time to get this ellipse. The most important one is the one here on the bottom, because that's what we're going to be looking at. And I realize mine needs to be a little steeper. So I'm doing this in pencil so we can get the shape first and then keep adjusting. So I think it needs to come down a little more. And I'm drawing the top part of the ellipse, which we don't see in the image, but I'm just drawing it to show you the structure. So I'm coming from this point to this point. This is going to be the part of the cone that's closest to us, and I'm coming from this point to this point, right? It makes a diamond shape, and then we can curve this line and come from this side and curve this line. So take your time and get it set up the way you want to. And after that, I'm going to extend the center line to create a triangle. Again, you don't have to use a ruler. I'm just doing it because it's easier. And this is a pretty long, narrow cone. You don't have to make it exact, but we're gonna make the top, like this is the point of the cone, and the edge of my 2 points on the center line, that is the triangle that you're thinking about. Okay, so we're always starting with the simple shapes and getting the basic outline of the cone down. Now I can erase any of the extra stuff I don't need. I might erase that dot just because it goes to a pretty fine point at the top, and I'm gonna erase all this stuff. So that's why I usually start drawings in pencil. And now I'm going to move on to charcoal for the shading. And we're also going to label this diagram just so you have it, you know, in your sketchbooks or somewhere in all these libraries and diagrams we've been making. You can keep it handy. Okay, so first thing before shading is I'm determining the light source. And in this image, I usually make an arrow. Oops, sorry about that noise. And this is the light source. So it's coming this way. And so the next thing I'm going to do is make a line for the core shadow. So it really is pretty much at that center line that I had, maybe a little bit further down. So I'm going to think about what part of my cone is in shadow, and it really spreads out over here because the highlight's kind of here. So then I'm going to fill in with a mid-tone the whole area that's in shadow. So I'm blocking in my shadow shape, and I'm using the side of my charcoal, and I'm making curved lines to match the curvature of the surface. Because when you use lines that go along with the form, and down here, you know, they would match the way that bottom curve. When you use lines that match the shape of the form, that's going to help show the three-dimensionality even better. So I'm just going to fill this in, all with kind of a mid-tone. So that's blocking in your shadow area, which we're going to do in the drawing. So it's a good thing to just get a lot of the tone down. You can come the other way and fill in any space. I'm leaving some room for reflected light, but all this area would be mid-tone. So you can really just fill in with the side of your charcoal pencil, or if you have a piece of charcoal, you can use the side of that, however, whatever you have. And I'm not worried about it being too perfect or anything yet. We're just getting the basic shapes down. And the next thing we're gonna do is darken that core shadow. And having this core shadow really dark is what helps turn the form. Notice I'm still using these curved lines. Remember with our texture drawing, when we made different line shapes, I'm making lines. I'm not smudging. I'm thinking about the curve of the cone and how these lines can help. And so it's really dark right along this line. So I want to emphasize that, because that is what these shadow changes are, what makes something look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, right? So just want to quickly get down where that core shadow is. And I see as we get closer to the bottom of the shape, it's kind of spreading out a little more, like fuzzing out. And right here is where it's really dark. So you can come in a different direction and start to add even more shading. And then I'm kind of going over the edges to soften the edges so that it doesn't look too much like I just drew one block here. I'm softening it into the midtones. So I'm integrating these lines into each other so they flow together. So this is almost like cross-hatching, right? But it's a little softer because it's charcoal, and I'm using the side of the charcoal as well. Okay, so that's my core shadow so far. I'm going to keep going before I get too detailed with that. And the next thing is the cast shadow. I didn't leave myself quite enough room, but we can have it go off the page as long as you get some of it in there. So I'm thinking about the overall shape, and I can see from this core shadow line, it's coming back into space this way. And it's a pretty sharp shadow because of the way the light is. So I'm going to further emphasize the outline of my cone with this core shadow. The core shadow is the darkest. I'm sorry, this is the cast shadow. The cast shadow is the darkest part. The cast shadow is darker than the core shadow. Let me label it for you because I want you to label it too. Okay, so this is cast shadow, which is where your cone or any object is hitting the surface. So it's how it makes it look like grounded in space and planted on the surface. And then the core shadow is here. And I should have done that in pen because I'm gonna smudge it all over the place. I'll go over it in pen so you can be sure to see. And then you wanna always be thinking about your light source before you start any shading so you know where your light and shadows are coming from. We have the cast shadow, and then we do have the highlight here. You can write highlight so you know exactly where the light is. Sometimes I can't talk and write. The highlight is right here, and we're thinking about the curve of the shape. So sometimes just drawing these lines can help you remember the curve of the way the shape is actually going. And then we have midtones. So the midtones are around the core shadow, usually on either side. Not every object you draw is going to be exactly like this. You know, this is for just to get everything in here, the specific demonstration, the way the light is in. And then we have the reflected light, which I've just left. Reflected light, which I've just left some space for. I haven't spent too much time on that. And that reflected light, if you remember, is also helping turn the form the way the core shadow is. So the reflected light is lighter than the midtone, but darker than the highlight. So you're always making these comparisons. The cast shadow is the darkest. So I'm going to continue to fill this in, and I'm using the side to really, and I'm using more pressure to really get a lot of charcoal down here. And where it's darkest, if we're thinking about where the light is coming from, right? It's darkest where no light is hitting it. So right around here, and you can really start to refine the shape and the edges of your object, of your cone, by drawing this shadow. And then you want to soften it out into the rest of the shadow that maybe isn't as dark, but is still very dark and has a very sharp line here. So thinking about your edges of your shadows, your edges of your shapes, get that all filled in, and you can start to go the other direction to make it really dark. Get a lot of charcoal on there. Okay, so what we're going to continue to do is refine now. So refine your edges, refine your shadow shapes, and we can see the bottom of this has a little bit of a cast shadow going almost all the way to here. So I'm gonna draw that. It's almost a line, but it's a little bit of a shadow shape. So I'm giving it a little bit of like almost texture, these like swiggle lines, and before it comes out. And then I'm gonna think about what's happening here. It is getting dark on the cone itself, but not as dark as the shadow. But I do need to start to darken some of this. So I'm gonna go in different directions to add more darkness into my shape. And this core shadow can get even darker. And so I'm using different directions of shading to help fill in. And you can even come here and just lightly, I'm doing kind of circles, fill in I'm using like a multimedia paper, so it does have a little tooth on it. And then we can see that this cast shadow, sorry, core shadow, I am so sorry. Those two words are very similar. And when I'm talking and drawing, this is the core. If you think about like the core of the shape, we can see it kind of feather out. So it's very dark here. I want to get this edge. It's not a perfectly straight line, but it's almost a straight line. There's like a little texture in the shape. So there's an edge here, and then there's a very light tone that comes around. So I kind of realized I lost these curved lines, so I'm coming back and getting them in over the top. And I'm just lightly, I'm not using a lot of pressure, so the amount of pressure you use helps too. And I'm gonna add a little more here because I think I can see there's more shadow shades here. And I'm not just drawing it here, I'm going over the cast shadow to kind of blend in these edges and soften them up a little bit. Let's see what's happening at the top here. There's a little more detail, and we need to get that kind of point in. So you can sharpen your charcoal, and it's very dark here, and it's gonna be, because it's turning quickly, if you think there's not as much turn happening, right? And then I see a little bit of a band of reflected light. So what we can start to do here, this is optional, but if you want to practice it, what you start to do here to get the reflected light is start to draw the background. Now on this photo that I have as an example, there's kind of 3 tones in the background. And I think that's helpful, and I'm sure the photographer did that on purpose because we can really make comparisons and see the reflected light in different ways. So there's like, this looks like this part's like a table and a shadow, and then there's some kind of dark area back here. So I can start to draw in this background, which is darker than the core shadow here, not as dark as the cast shadow here. So I'm making comparisons. I'm looking at this. This area could be a little bit close to the cast shadow, but I still think from the way I'm seeing it that this cast shadow here is the darkest. So whatever your values are in your drawing, you know, you could always make a value scale if you wanted to, you're making comparisons. So this background shade is very dark, but not exactly as dark as the cast shadow. But that darkness, and then it fades out up here. That darkness is what's going to help us make the reflected light, because then we have this space here to have the reflected light in. So I'm just gonna refine these edges. It gets a little lost here, so I'm just gonna let it get lost. I'm gonna soften them up. And then there's like a break, like it looks like this is a table. And sometimes you can take artistic license here. I'm just gonna like kind of do more scribbles because it's in the background. And this is dark, but not as dark. Not nearly as dark as the core shadow, and definitely not as dark as the cast shadow. So I'm gonna let that lighten up a little bit. So shading in the background is a really great way to emphasize your shape and get that kind of reflected light in there. And I'm deciding to keep all these lines vertical just because I think it'll be helpful for our drawing. So you can make those kind of artistic decisions here. So I'm gonna further refine this edge, and now I'm using kind of the pointy part of my charcoal pencil, and I'm gonna come in and get that shape. And you know what I think we might do, which is fun, I don't know if we've done in this class before, I'm gonna do some eraser stuff. So I'm gonna get my lines, I'm gonna keep adding lines to kind of soften and unify these shadow shapes that I've made. And I'm gonna continue making the core shadow darker. And if I ended up making this core shadow too dark, we can always come back and make the cast shadow darker, because that's darker, right? The one that's on the floor. So I can always come back and do that. Okay, I'm just softening these up, and I think you can see my lines are not, I'm not making them perfectly even. I'm kind of doing a layer over everything to unify these shadow shapes so they're not too blocky, and to bring us back to this cylinder shape that with these sort of curved lines that curve along the form of the shape. And I didn't like how this was getting kind of too, you know, looking too much like a line, the core shadow, where I wanted to sort of break it up a little bit. So I'm just coming in with the details. Okay. I am going to take my eraser, I have a kneaded eraser, and I'm gonna make it into a very fine point. And I'm gonna come in and clean this up for the reflected light, because there was pencil left there and all kinds of other stuff going on. So I'm just gonna get some of that cleaned up. And now we know the reflected light isn't as light as the shadow, as the highlight. It's a little darker. So we do need to darken it a little bit, but I'm gonna try, this is a little bit of a softer charcoal. So I'm gonna come in really lightly and just get an even tone on here more intentionally than I had it before. So I kind of cleaned it up and erased it to then go over it again, but that's okay. That's a good way to do things. And I'm gonna come over in this direction and kind of fade it in. Because we can see here, this is much darker than this light area where the light is hitting this table or whatever it's sitting on. And then it's a little lighter here. And then we really see how light the reflected light is up here, even though it has tone on it. It's so much of a contrast between this background shade. So then I can come back into the background and add more shading here to help with our form. And this might be a place, if you love your smudge tool, here's my old smudge tool, this would be a great place to smudge once you have all this charcoal on here. You can start to smudge the background. And you know, smudging kind of pushes stuff into the background because there's not as much detail in the smudging because you're mushing everything together. So it's kind of like, almost like with photography, the depth of field, where it's gonna sort of look blurry and fade into the background. Okay, now I think you could also do this in the core shadow, but I like the idea of seeing the lines here in the object itself. This is another place, I think, in the cast shadow that could be good for smudging if you want to have fun with that. So you can keep going with this, or this is enough for the practice, just to practice creating these different types of shadows. So I want you to make sure to label your drawing, label the core shadow, label the light source, label the highlight, midtones, and cast shadow. So you just start to remember what all those things are called, and you remember to include them in your sketch. Okay, now this is fun and I could do it forever, but I don't want this video to be too long. So you can keep going with yours, or this is, plenty to let me know that you understand these concepts. Have fun with it.